Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. We're going to start to mind the time, so there are time for questions afterwards. My name is Jens Zimmermann. I teach philosophy and theology over at Regent College. Regent College, I see our former bookstore manager here, is best theological bookstore in Canada. If you wanted to look at theological books and some philosophy books and literature, come to Regent College. Also, it's got a great coffee shop there. Not that you're lacking any here. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker today, and thank you all for coming out and a noon lecture on Heidegger and God. That's pretty good. I'm very glad you're all here. Holger Zaborowski, I've known Holger for about 20 years. We got to know each other through our common interest in Heidegger. He is professor of philosophy in the Catholic faculty at the University of Erfurt in Germany. If you ever wanted to go to like an Oxford-type city in Germany, Erfurt is the place. Like if you want to go, it's a beautiful kind of place if you want to do German and philosophy and all kinds of theological figures from Luther to Eckhart and so on. It's all there. The Romantics are there in Jena, in Weimar, Goethe, Schlegel, Fichte, Hegel, everything around Erfurt. All right. So Professor Zaborowski studied philosophy, theology, and classics at Freiburg, Basel, Cambridge, and Oxford universities. His PhD under Oliver O'Donovan in Oxford. And his main research interests are German idealism, 20th century German philosophy, ethics, and the philosophy of religion. And obviously, Heidegger is one of the main figures that Professor Zaborowski researches. He is kind of what people refer solely to the Heidegger industry in Germany. He does conferences in Meßkirch biannually or so on Heidegger. If those of you are interested, there's always a call for papers. Meßkirch is also a very nice city. I'll stop here for the German tourist industry. And he has published a lot of books, like some of his own works on continental phenomenology and books on there's phenomenology of food, there's phenomenology of life. He's edited more books than most of us will be able to read. And I'm not exaggerating a whole lot. So if you're interested in a correspondence, for instance, between Heidegger and some theological figures like Bernhard Welte, or Max Müller, and so on. These are all edited by Holger, these correspondences and so on, right? I mean, so he really knows his stuff. That's what I'm trying to say. And we're very much looking forward, Holger, to your talk on In Search of the Divine God, Heidegger, the Transformative Art of Philosophy and Religion. Help me welcome Professor Zaborowski.
Well, thank you very much, Jens, for this very, very kind introduction. And thank you, Anders and Jens, for having me here, for inviting me to speak about Heidegger today. And thank you all for coming to a Heidegger lecture at 12:45. Well, I hope I make it nutritious enough for you to get nourished, to get away and leave nourished and get some ideas about Heidegger's relation to God and to religion. When I was preparing this lecture, I thought about not just looking at one period of Heidegger's life very, very deeply. I would like to talk about his whole life, which means that I can't, given that I don't have so much time, it means that I can't go into sort of every little detail of these periods, but it's also a sort of introduction to Heidegger's life, to his way of thinking, how his thinking developed. And it's also a kind of introduction to continental philosophy in the 20th century. Some of the sort of main concerns, main ideas will pop up. The title is In Search of a Divine God, Heidegger, the Transformative Art of Philosophy and Religion. In Search of a Divine God, this is alluding to a statement by the later Heidegger, where he says, look, I'm looking for the divine God, not the God of metaphysics, not the God of what he calls calculative thinking, a thinking that is sort of mainly based on logical thinking, that's based on sort of classical metaphysical tradition. So he would say we need a different approach in a time that he considered the time of the end of metaphysics, the end of metaphysics traditionally understood. And his search for the divine God is closely related to two important elements. One is his own upbringing, his own way of life, his biography. So in Heidegger's case, there are some philosophers where you don't need to know much about their biography, or as a matter of fact, in some cases, we don't know much about their biography, and that's fine. In Heidegger's case, it's very different. His biography, his experiences, his personal life is very closely intertwined with his philosophy and his way of philosophizing. So this is one element, his biography, that's important here. And then his understanding of philosophy is important as well. He understood philosophy as a way of life. So it's not a sort of merely theoretical exercise. It's not that he would say, okay, I go to the office 9 to 5, and then I do philosophy, and then I go back home and play soccer or do something else and go into my garden and do something else. He understood, and this is a very traditional understanding of philosophy. Philosophy is a way of life, means to philosophize. And for him, this leads to a new understanding of doing philosophy that led to his break with Husserl's phenomenology. Husserl was his main teacher, but Husserl was the sort of, he didn't really, even though he was living his philosophy, but he understood philosophy as a rigorous science. And Heidegger roots philosophy very much in his life, in his own life. And I would like to look at 4 periods of his life. There is what is called the so-called young Heidegger, running from his PhD habilitation up to 1923. This is the so-called early Freiburg period. And it's a very interesting period because for a long time people thought, well, nothing really happened, and everything he did until he published Being and Time wasn't anything but just preparation for his big important book. And then people got to know some of the lecture notes and seminar notes from this period, and they realized something really interesting was going on in this time. And as Jens mentioned, there are important letter exchanges going back to this time as well that are very helpful in understanding the formation of Heidegger, the thinker. So many, many interesting ideas are developed in this early period. I'd like to talk about this early period first. Then I would like to very briefly talk about the period of Being and Time. So we talk about the late 20s, 1927, roughly. Then I'd like to focus on the 1930s. This is after his rectoral address, after his time as a rector. He tried to find a very new way of doing philosophy at the time. It's his way of criticizing National Socialism as well, but in a very complicated, very subtle way. Not in terms of an open political criticism, but in terms of criticizing not just National Socialism, but the whole of Western metaphysics. And he would consider National Socialism as being part of this whole history of Western thinking. And in doing so, he was trying to prepare a new beginning of thought, a new beginning of thinking. And then fourthly, I would like to look very briefly at his very, very late period. So it's basically a lunch with 4 courses, and then we have a discussion, and I look forward to your comments and questions as well. I talked about his understanding of philosophy as a way of thinking as well, and let me just give you a couple of 1 or 2 citations that illustrate this very nicely. One is in a very early lecture course. And the nice thing about Heidegger is he would sort of write down all his lecture courses, which means that nowadays we have good knowledge about his early lecture courses, much more than just notes. So we really know what he presented, and he was just reading it out. And in one of his very early lecture courses, a course on Aristotle called Phenomenological Interpretation of Aristotle, and he gave this course in 1921, 1922, he asks, must philosophy be? And he answers the question as follows. He says, somehow yes, if life, existence is supposed to be. Supposed to be, it is actually there. If you know the later Heidegger, you already have the language of existence, of being there. But what's important here is the whole idea of philosophy must be, because it is related to life. It's a performance of one's own life. It's not just the performance of one's life. He would say to philosophize means to, so philosophy basically originates in one's life performance and then leads back to it as well. Or he would say, the solid ground of philosophy lies in grasping the questionable. That is, in the radical raising of questions. Grasping is concerned, bringing oneself into radical decision-making in the explicit research task. So this is what he would tell his students in the early 20s and in the 1920s, prior to being in time, very famous 20th century, very many famous 20th century philosophers would be in attendance. You know, Hannah Arendt would be there, Karl Löwit, Hans Jonas, many people who became very important philosophers of their own rights. There would be there as well. So philosophy, to do philosophy means to ask questions, to raise radical questions, and to bring oneself into radical decision making. So the language is, if you know the 1920s, if you read literature, philosophy, art, if you look at art or even music in the 1920s, it's the post-war period. A lot of traditional certainties are being questioned. They're no longer possible. And Heidegger is part of this. He belongs to a generation of philosophers. Jaspers belongs to the very same tradition. Or the Jewish philosopher Franz Rosenzweig belongs to this tradition as well. Many other people, many important theologians, Karl Barth, Paul Tillich, belong to this tradition as well. These were people who were quite young during World War I, not fully established in their thinking yet. And they try to, a very new way of thinking in this post-war period. And this makes it very, very interesting to see. Some of you may have heard about Ernst Cassirer, the German philosopher. He was born in 1875, 14 years before Heidegger was born. Heidegger was born in 1889. And for Cassirer, World War I wasn't a big event. I mean, it was, of course, historically important, but for his way of thinking, it wasn't so important because he was already settled. Yeah? Or for Heidegger's teacher, Husserl. Husserl just kept writing, endless manuscripts that haven't been fully edited yet, and people will still work decades to edit his texts. So he just kept writing and analyzing them, but it's almost as if he didn't really notice the war. Of course, he lost his son. I mean, biographical events happened, but it didn't have this sort of impact on him. And in Heidegger's case, it's different. And for Heidegger, this means if we look at this emphasis on decision-making, asking radical questions, on the passion that he relates to philosophy, we have to relate this as well to what we can call the theological origins of his thinking. There is sometimes, it's if I try to if I teach Heidegger and try to introduce Heidegger, there are different ways. You could say he's mainly concerned with the question of being, or he's mainly concerned with metaphysics and the history of metaphysics. But another possible narrative is to say he's constantly dealing with his own theological origins. So the question of God is somehow present from the very beginning. At some point, he wanted to become a Catholic priest. He studied theology. And he was part of a movement that is called anti-modernism. So he was very, very critical of modernity as a young man. His very earliest public lectures in his hometown were sort of criticizing modernity, the spirit of modernity. Interestingly enough, at this point, he was already reading and citing Nietzsche as a critic of modernity, because Nietzsche was, of course, one of the important critics of modernity, but you wouldn't expect a Catholic student in 1914 or 1915 to read Nietzsche and to cite Nietzsche positively as a source for understanding his own age. So he was a very devout Catholic in the beginning. He didn't study philosophy at first. He then, when he decided to study philosophy rather than theology, the reason was not that he had lost his faith at this point, around 1911, 1912. The reason was simply that he didn't want to become a priest, and he wanted to basically support the Catholic Church as a philosopher. by doing apologetics, by defending the faith, by preparing the foundation for a new understanding of faith. Later on in his life, Heidegger would, in one of his late writings, say, "Without this theological background, I should never have come upon the path of thinking. But origin always comes to meet us from the future." So basically, the origins, one's past, always comes to one from the future as well. He realized that he couldn't just detach himself totally from his past, that his past was part of who he was, who he became. But it's extremely interesting, and these letters help us very much to understand Heidegger's way of thinking, that it doesn't take long, and he breaks with what he calls the system of Catholicism. And it was the neo-scholastic system, so neo-Thomistic system by and large, very dry, very sterile, very formalistic, that he would try to get away from. It didn't, there was no hope, according to Heidegger, in this way of thinking, in specific, very formalistic, very dry way of thinking. But I'd like to give you some examples as well of some of his early texts, because he wrote some poetry as well. And one poem runs as follows. It's called "Hours of the Mount of Olives of My Life." Yes, he's comparing and contrasting his own life to the life of Christ. He says, "Hours of the Mount of Olives of my life, in the grim glow of discouraged hesitation, you have seen me often. Cryingly I called never in vain. My young being has, tired of lamenting, only trusted the angel grace." This was written and published in 1915, so one of the earliest publications by Heidegger. And if you study literature, you may find some Rilke and Trakl in this. So this is a young man who's read a lot of Rilke and Trakl and contemporary expressionist poetry. But there are some really interesting indications here, some keywords in this poem that, if we had more time, we could just use this poem to almost look at Heidegger's way of thinking. He talks about the angel grace. Later on, he talks about the event of being, something that is sort of structurally very close to this. I mean, it is very different because it's a philosophical concept, but there are some kind of resonances here. And you see someone in an existential crisis. Because at this point, he's losing the traditional way of believing in God, the way that he was familiar with in those years, and he's trying to reorient his own thinking at his own life. It is very remarkable that in this poem, he doesn't simply follow the traditional sort of official neo-scholastic theological way of thinking to overcome his crisis. It's a very existential crisis. You can already see there is something radical happening here in this poem. So he's only trusting the angel grace. His experiences hours of the Mount of Olives. So he's comparing his life to the passion, to the suffering of Christ in this text. So this is, in a way, an indication that something really important is happening in this time. He doesn't leave away. And we do have a couple of more poems written in this time that show a very similar mindset. But I would like to focus now more on the 1920s. So this is a little background. Heidegger was first trained to be a theologian, decided to study philosophy rather than theology. There's this sort of anti-modern context in which he is raised, in which he's educated, a skepticism about modernity, many of the key ideas of modernity, but he's also at the same time sort of struggling with his faith. And he starts to read then, being deeply influenced by Catholic theology, a new reading, or a sort of neo-scholastic reading, a reading of Aquinas, of the Thomistic tradition, and the sort of classical sources. And he's then reading a lot of Protestant sources in the late 19 teens. He's turning to Luther, to Schleiermacher, to Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard becomes very important. Nietzsche plays an important role. So you can see all these thinkers, particularly 19th century thinkers, that became important for the development of existential philosophy, are thinkers that Heidegger reads in this period as well, and he becomes influenced by them. So he breaks with the system of Catholicism, a system of thinking. He realizes he's a philosopher, not a theologian, and he's trying to develop a new way of doing philosophy. But he doesn't distance himself from the question of God after he's left the system of Catholicism. And he doesn't distance himself. He still asks the question of what is a truly Christian tradition. In a letter to his friend, Professor of Dogmatics, he says that Christianity and metaphysics had not become problematic and unacceptable for him. On the contrary, one could say that the question of a religious existence continued to guide him, at least in the early 20s. So in those formative years leading up to being a Thai. And in 1920, he writes a letter to Karl Löwit, very famous philosopher Karl Löwit, who was Heidegger's disciple, a student of Heidegger's at the time. He says, "Currently I'm destructing myself. What is most difficult?" So he's, in the background of his thinking is this kind of self-destruction, which means to analyze basically who he is, to analyze how he has become who he is. And he realizes this is very difficult because it is related to his origins. For us today, it's sometimes difficult to understand what it means for Heidegger to break from Catholicism. But this is more than 100 years ago. You have his parents, his family, a very traditional way of belief. He was supported financially by the church. He expected a professorship, basically to teach philosophy in a Catholic or theological context. So breaking with the church was really, really a very important decision in his life. But he's still interested after this breaking away from the church in what he calls the genuinely Christian. He's well aware that this dimension of thinking is noted by other people as well. So he says in the same letter to Löwit that he wrote to Karl Löwit in 1920 that I'm not being understood as a philosopher, I am still a theologian. And this is very interesting in his life, because he calls himself still, when he looks at his factual origins, a Christian theologian. But not in the common academic or ecclesiastical sense, but in the sense of someone who, as shown by the underlining of the part of the word in theologian, he tries to discover the real logos, the real reason of the Christian God. So he would say, I'm currently, this is written in a letter to Karl Löwit, he says, I work concretely and factually from my I am, from my intellectual, factual origins, milieu, life context, from what is accessible to me, from there as a living existence in which I live. This facticity, as existential, is not mere blind Dasein, it is part of a lived existence. It includes an unspoken I must, an inner obligation that guides me. Existence surges with this facticity of being, that is, with the historical. However, I live the inner obligations of my facticity, and as radically as I understand them. My facticity includes what I briefly describe as being a Christian theologian. This brings with it a certain radical self-concern and a commitment to scientific rigor. Within my facticity lies a strict objectivity, an awareness of intellectual history and historical consciousness. I am this within the life context of the university. This is part of a letter that Heidegger wrote to one of his students. So he wrote very long letters to his students. And I mean, as you can see, and again, if we had more time, we could sort of focus on this text. But if you've read Heidegger or some 20th century philosophy, you heard many, many key words of 20th century thinking in this letter. But Heidegger used this letter basically to explain himself what is going on in the early 1920s to his friend and student Karl Löwit. And when I very briefly summarize what's important here is he's distanced himself from Catholicism, this sort of system, and World War I and the experience of the war played a major role here as well, because he realized, given the challenges of his time, just imagine you live in 1918, 1919 in Germany, 1920. Yeah, this very different political system, very poor material conditions. Many problems, and people were looking for some kind of orientation. So Heidegger experienced this total loss of meaning as well, and now it's basically philosophy and philosophizing that becomes so radical and existential to him. They're asking the questions, working out of what he calls his facticity, which means he says, I can't simply start with abstract problems, just theoretical issues. I have to start with who I am. I have to look at who I am as a human being. I have to start with my concrete factical existence. And you could say, if you analyze this, it's almost as if now philosophy has taken on the role of religion. It's grounded, it's not merely a theoretical exercise, it's grounded in its existence. It has a radical character, it's related to radical decisions that he has to make, and so on. And it is very interesting for scholars that he even explicitly says in this period he considers himself still to be a Christian theologian. So somehow the question of God is still present in this time, but not anymore in the sort of previous Catholic context. Now it's more a Protestant view that plays an important role in this context. So he has basically, if we look at his life, there's a sort of dual orientation. One, towards philosophy, towards a new understanding of phenomenology, towards basically transforming Husserl's phenomenology. Husserl understood phenomenology as a rigorous science, very much in sort of traditional terms, if you look at sort of modern philosophy. And then, of course, Heidegger was surrounded by all kinds of neo-philosophers, neo-Kantians, neo-Hegelians, neo-Thomists, so people who would try to retrieve a certain element from the tradition. And in Heidegger, you have this radical, he's not just breaking with the system of Catholicism in this time, he's also breaking with Husserl's understanding of phenomenology as a rigorous science, as a sort of scientific enterprise. And he's also criticizing already at this point the neo-Kantian approaches or neo-Hegelian approaches. Is trying to do something new. And I think this is the reason why so many of his students in the early 1920s were so impressed by him, and because not less because of what he said and much more because of how he said it, how he did philosophy. So philosophy was essentially a radical questioning. There's a religious impulse there that's quite important. There's still this desire to find some kind of answer for the question of God, but he would say in this period, philosophy needs to be atheistic. And that's very interesting because previously, if you look at the Catholic understanding, you could say, well, philosophy helps theology and might, for example, provide proofs of the existence of God, provide argumentative reasons to believe in God. And now he would say philosophy needs to be atheistic because God, believing God, plays now a substantial role in a very different way of life, and sort of the more religious way of life and more theological way of life. So he separates philosophy from religion, but he's still as a believer trying to look for what Christianity really is, trying to look for the truth of religion. But he says philosophy doesn't need to be concerned with this. Philosophy needs to free itself from this task. But it's very interesting in the 1920s, so we move on very, very slowly towards being a time that while Heidegger in the early 20s still upholds and maintains his religious interest, even though in a very transformed manner. He loses this in the course of the 1920s. So in the late 20s, in the period of being in time, he does no longer consider himself a Christian theologian, and he does no longer consider himself a Christian. So he leaves this fully behind. He increasingly distanced himself from theology and also from his religious origins in Christianity. He now differentiated between philosophy and theology, and as I said, he did so in the early 1920s. He emphasized the difference between theology and philosophy. So philosophy, the atheistic, just about expressing the radical questioning of one's own life, the facticity of one's own life, and then the religious dimension. This is where your people would, with a very, think of Karl Barth, the famous Protestant theologian, who's writing in this time as well. Heidegger read Barth, so the emphasis on revelation or grace that we already discovered in his poem as well. So this is the early 20s. In the late 20s, he still differentiates between philosophy and theology, but under completely different auspices. He wrote a lecture called Phenomenology and Theology in 1927, the year in which Being in Time was published. And he says theology is a positive science, and as such, therefore, is absolutely different from philosophy. So he would say theology is a positive science like history or literature studies, so it's like, because it's related to something that is positively given. For history, it's the facts of history. For English studies, it's English poetry and novels. And for theology, it's revelation and the experience of faith. And he would say philosophy is not a positive science. Because philosophy is sort of an ontological science that provides on a much deeper, more foundational level, key concepts that we need to understand. And in this time, he would say theology could learn from philosophy. But he's writing this with sort of an attitude of distancing himself from theology. So he would say, the philosopher is asking the general questions and providing the answers about, the structures of being, the structure of human existence, and then the positive sciences, they can refer to it, but they don't need to. Philosophy does not need theology here. So Heidegger speaks now about theology and religion clearly from the outside, no longer from the inside. He's no longer an insider. In the early 20s, he was still an insider. Now he speaks about theology from the outside without seeing himself anymore as a Christian theologian. So you don't find this language anymore. This is a couple of years later, a totally different self-understanding. In 1928, he wrote a letter to his friend Elisabeth Blochmann, an educational scholar of education, with reference to this lecture, Phenomenology and Theology, saying that if the task had been different from that which he had addressed in this lecture, the concept of philosophy should have been exposed as a whole and, as you quite rightly see, should have been opposed not only to theology, but to religion and not only to Christianity. So you would say, here, philosophy needs to be opposed to theology and to religion. So if we look at those 10 years between 1914, 15, 16, 17, up to 1927, so more than 10 years, you see Heidegger, the anti-modernist Catholic philosopher who loses faith in Catholicism, turns towards Protestant sources, Luther, Schleiermacher, Kierkegaard, and so on. So distinguishes sharply between philosophy and theology, but still has a sort of religious interest. It's still looking for the divine God. To the late 20s, where he says, no, there's a difference, and the theologians, they can kind of take up my ideas, but I don't need to engage in a dialogue with theology anymore. I have a sort of, I do something that is much more fundamental here. So there's a big difference here, and I think this explains a lot of his later thinking. This is the period when Heidegger turns away from Christianity the most in his life. And if we look at the 1930s, we can see that this distancing himself from Christianity is continued. And I don't want to talk, at least maybe you have questions about this, but at least in my paper I don't want to talk very much about the relation between Heidegger and National Socialism, which is of course a very hot topic in Heidegger research. But let me just make one comment on this. You could argue that what happens in Heidegger's life and what explains the way how he does philosophy is that philosophy more and more turns away from asking questions, from being the sort of radical questioning that he emphasizes in the early 20s, to providing ultimate answers. So particularly in the late 20s, early 30s, philosophy takes on this nature. And then you could argue that at some point he was looking for a source of orientation. And that's very clear in all of his thinking. He was looking for a meaning of being, but a meaning of the human being as well, a meaning of human life, which would not just be a formal sort of meaning that he was looking for, but it was always an existential meaning. He lost faith in religion, faith in God, and for a certain point of time, a very short period of time, of course, Hitler played an almost messianic role for Heidegger. So this explains his fascination. And it's in the early 1930s already embedded in his idea that he needs to provide an account of the whole history of Western metaphysics, starting with the pre-Socratics. So it's a long history that he's trying to cover. And to cut a very long story short, he realized that the biggest problem in the late 20s, early 30s is the problem of nihilism. So Nietzsche plays an important role here. The problem of loss of meaning, loss of orientation. And for a short period of time, he thought, well, not believing in God or not taking his religious origins as seriously as he did previously, for a short period of time, he thought, well, Hitler could fill in the void that had developed. Hitler could provide an answer to the whole question of meaning. So Hitler and National Socialism, the political movement, would help us to overcome modern nihilism. So basically, the political movement of National Socialism, so he thought, could help us, or help people back then, to overcome nihilism that Heidegger considered to be a part of, and the final part, the ultimate part, if you like, the completion of the history of metaphysics. So he had this idea that the whole history of metaphysics, from the very beginning, would lead towards nihilism and would find an end in nihilism. And then Hitler could provide an answer to this. But he soon realized that this wasn't the case, that National Socialism was essentially not the answer to the problem of nihilism, but the radicalization, the deepening of nihilism. It was nihilistic itself, not a solution, not an answer. But you can see there's still a sort of, some kind of, the looking for a divine God at work here. If you understand by looking for a divine God, looking for a source of meaning, a source of orientation, a source of, finding some kind of foundation. So this happens in the early 1930s. What happens in the mid 30s is now very, very interesting, and let me just very briefly summarize this, given that I'm running out of time, but I can do this very quickly. And this leads back to the political question, the question of politics in Heidegger's work, because after Heidegger stepped down from the rectorate, he wrote a letter to his close friend and colleague Karl Jaspers, who, of course, criticized Heidegger as well because of his involvement in National Socialism. And in this letter to Jaspers, written on July 1st, 1935, he speaks about two thorns in his flesh. So the two thorns are a reference to St. Paul, the thorn in the flesh, but Heidegger has two thorns in his flesh. And the first thorn in his flesh is the conflict with the faith of his origins and the failure of the rectorate. And my suggestion is both these thorns belong together. Yeah, losing his own faith and the failure of the rectorate. Because the rectorate, as rector, Heidegger was enthusiastically embracing National Socialism and Hitler as the leader of the German people, not just understanding Hitler as a political figure, but basically as a metaphysical event, as the answer to the whole challenge of nihilism. Suddenly, in a time of the loss of meaning in the 1920s came to an end because Hitler was there, National Socialism provided the answer. That's what he thought for a short period of time. But he realized a couple of years later that he failed and his understanding was wrong. And that this was very problematic as well. So he would talk about these two thorns, the understanding of the faith of his origins and the failure of his rectorate. So you could say, when we talk about Heidegger and politics, we have to talk about Heidegger and religion as well. Having lost his faith, and having understanding that in the 1920s, the whole history of Western metaphysics as nihilistic, leading towards nihilism, he was tempted to think that Hitler now plays almost the role of a messiah, providing an answer to the whole question of meaning, the loss of meaning. And it doesn't take long again, in the mid-1930s, and I will just briefly mention this, that Heidegger criticizes his own view and criticizes National Socialism, but not in political terms and not publicly, but in trying to develop his own very idiosyncratic later philosophy, which he attempts basically as first of all, a reading of the whole history of metaphysics, as a critique of Christianity as well. He's very radical in his critique of Christianity, of Judaism in this time as well. And his attempt is to find a totally new beginning of thinking, to prepare a new way of thinking, doing something new that would no longer be limited by the frames of the framework of the history of metaphysics. And in this, I will just briefly mention this, we find considerations about the last God. So basically he's now doing almost some kind of philosophical theology in which the question of God basically shows up again, but he's trying almost in a sort of very speculative philosophical manner to talk about God he's no longer considering himself a phenomenologist. He's sort of trying to develop a new way of thinking about God, where basically the pre-Socratics play a major role, or the poet Hölderlin and his way of talking about God, but it's no longer the Christian God. And this is one of his main concerns in this time. So it's again, if we understand the question of God as the question of a source of meaning, a source of orientation, a foundation for one's existence, it does play a major role in the 1930s as well. But now he's trying to solve the problem merely philosophically. So you could say, if I summarize 4 steps, the very first step would be he finds a source of meaning in this Catholic faith, in this early Catholic anti-modern period. And we do find we now have many texts written by a very young Heidegger, written by Heidegger when he was still a student, that really show this anti-modernistic outlook. Changes fast, at World War I and private experiences, and philosophical thinking played an important role in his turning away from this way too harmonious view of reality. So basically, that's when he read Protestant sources, differentiated between philosophy and theology, philosophizing that needs to be atheistic, and one's own religious desire to come to an understanding of God, the genuine Christian, early 20s. Third period, late 20s, roughly speaking, when he says, well, philosophy is the major ontological discipline, and theologians can use and refer to philosophy, and they should do so, but they are basically, it's an ontic, a positive science that's related to revelation, but he is no longer considering himself to be interested in it, not even personally. Then, of course, the whole question, what is a possible source of meaning, shows up and remains unanswered until he finds, for a brief period of time, a solution in Hitler, and takes Hitler and National Socialism to provide an answer to the nihilism, the loss of meaning. He leaves this behind, next step, 1930s, in which he thinks about the last God, thinks about God philosophically within a totally new framework. So he's not returning to anything. He's not returning to Aquinas or to Eckhart at this point or to other thinkers. He's not starting a new dialogue with figures in the history of philosophy. He's saying, well, as metaphysics has come to an end, and that's a very exciting period in Heidegger's life, because in this period he's trying to find new ways of thinking that explain partly why he's become such an influential and important thinker. Because this is the period in which he's one of the last who tries to provide, who does a reading and offers a reading of the whole history of metaphysics, tries to understand it, tries to find some kind of meaning to the history of metaphysics, and he's also opening up possibilities of a new dialogue, of bridging, building bridges towards other cultures, this is when his dialogue with Asian thinking starts. This is when his dialogue with, again, a new reading of the pre-Socratics comes into play, a new reading of poetry when he becomes interested in art and poetry as dialogue partners. So this is the 1930s. And I promised to say something about the very late Heidegger. The interesting about the very late Heidegger is that he somehow, to a certain extent, returns to his old faith. He doesn't read, not in a full sense, but there is much more of an understanding of a relation between philosophy and theology and religion. There is still a lot to be discovered in his later thought, where a new dialogue at least is possible. In a certain period, in the 1930s, he's still criticizing the Judeo-Christian tradition very much. He's distancing himself very radically from this tradition. He's trying to find a new way of thinking. In the 50s, 60s, up to his death, he would still, at least when he talks about these issues, you find a new way of, a new openness towards the religious experience of thinking about religion. It's not that it's a little sad, he didn't write a big book about these topics, or didn't lecture on these topics widely, so we don't have this, but it's another interesting period as well, which I consider sometimes the most interesting and important period, the period post-1940, 1941, because this is when Heidegger is trying to prepare a new way of thinking, when he thought about language, about technology, about so many important issues in a new way. That's the fascinating element about Heidegger is that he would, when people started to publish his collected works, he would say, well, it's not works, it's ways. So it's not works that are finished and that you can sort of study and understand and focus on. He would rather his way of thinking is really a way of thinking. The way character of thinking was very important to him. And in his very late period, we find a certain kind of new openness towards the religion of his origins as well. This is when he would say origins always remain future. Because he realized, and I think that's a very important element as well, that he was distancing himself from his own radical nature, the radical questioning of himself and of his own past, in realizing that he could never get rid of his origins, that his origins always remain future. So one way, it's not the only way, there are many different ways of understanding Heidegger's way of life, his way of thinking, but one way is clearly to say, if I want to provide one narrative of understanding his thinking, his way of life, his way of thinking from the very beginning to the end until his death, one narrative, and I think it's a very persuasive narrative, is to say there's always this looking for God, this looking for a divine God. There are his early religious struggles that lead him to leave traditional Catholicism behind. There is his Protestant period in which he, against the Protestant background, distinguished sharply between philosophy and religion. He was looking for what is the genuine Christian. So you hear a lot of Kierkegaard here in the question of what is genuinely Christian, or Overbeck, and a lot of Nietzsche as well in this period. So what is the real Christian? And then later on, in the late 20s, he would. It's almost as if now philosophy takes on the role of theology. It's philosophy that provides this ultimate meaning. Or philosophy can tell us that some political movement like National Socialism can help us to overcome nihilism. If you read his rectoral address, some critics have said he wanted to lead the leader. He wanted to provide meaning. He wanted to interpret National Socialism in a way that National Socialism could not possibly interpret itself. So basically, philosophy takes on almost a quasi-religious role as well, as a source of meaning, as a source of definite statements. This runs through the 1930s. And then, beginning in the early 40s, there's a very significant shift in his thinking. The language of releasement, of letting be, a language of hearing, of listening, the language not of calculation, of calculative thinking, but of mindful thinking. Thinking that looks for the meaning that is behind things. The German word for mindful is besinnlich, and in besinnlich there is Sinn, meaning, the meaning of being, der Sinn von Sein. So that's looking for the meaning of being comes into play as well. And it also has to do with the question of what is a truly divine God, not the God of metaphysics. So here you hear Pascal when he says, well, not the God of the philosophers, but the God of Isaac and Jacob, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So Heidegger would say as well, how can I think of, how can I talk, not about, but how can I talk of such a divine God, and how could thinking help us to do so, and what does this mean for thinking as well, and for philosophy? Later on he rather speaks of thinking, not so much of philosophy. What does it mean for philosophy as well, and in relation to its own history, and in its relation to the history of metaphysics? And I think this makes Heidegger very, very interesting for many disciplines, not just for philosophy, but for contemporary theology, for art, for poetry, the reading of poetry, because Heidegger opens up new ways of thinking, and behind all his attempts stands, in a way you could say, not exclusively, but also his search for a divine God. I thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.